The first time I came to Istanbul, I was 18 years old, went to Istanbul and Üsküdar, and that's a very long time ago. It is also a pleasure to have been asked to address, I think, what is a challenge, and that is the question of finance and housing. No problem with high profit-making housing. The problem is low-income housing profit. And what I want to address is the following possibility. When I look at global finance over the last 15 years, what I see is an enormously innovative sector, creative, more creative, frankly, than most artists I know. They have invented ways, the global financiers, of making money of activities that we thought could not make money. What I see on the other side of the ledger is a vast demand for housing. I worry only, really, about low-income housing. Low-income housing has fallen more and more out of the circuits of finance capital. I was profoundly impressed with many of the projects, I can't quite say all, but many of the projects presented by the mayors, by the head of the housing authority, by the TOKİ documentary. I learned that word. Actually, I know it's not a word, TOKİ, but it's easy. And also by the Prime Minister's sort of passion about the question of housing, which I completely share, of course. And I think that the government in this country has innovated in terms of low-income housing, the financing part, more than the global financial sector has, by transforming the question of paying the mortgage into a question of paying the same money that it would take to pay your rent. That is an innovation. That is truly a brilliant innovation. On the one hand, very simple. On the other hand, evidently, enormously difficult to do because it has been done very little. It hasn't been done enough around the world. What I want to develop a bit is the whole notion of how innovative finance has been, and on the other hand, the question of how do we transform a need which, if you look at it as a global need, is the housing of 2 billion people. How do we transform that need into an effective demand? I should clarify that while I'm a researcher on finance, especially global finance, I do think that the government is a critical actor in this. I am not what you might call, how shall we call this person, who believes that the markets are the only ones who know how to do this. Not at all. I just want to put it out as an experiment. Why is it that finance, that has developed incredibly innovative instruments over the last 15 years, can't quite wrap its collective global brain around the question of finding an instrument that manages to transform a massive need into an effective demand? And again, the demand is huge. I would say that the firm that invents that instrument has quite a future ahead of itself, at least for a while. Now, on the innovations of finance, I think that what's happening today is, I think, stretching the elements, the potentials of a history that started in much simpler ways in the late 1980s. I'm assuming that a lot of the people in the audience know this history of innovations, and I'm also assuming that a lot of them do not. So let me capture the beginning point of this innovation. And again, my question is, what I'm really interested in is, why can't we innovate around the question of low-income housing the way we have done around other issues? For short, the great invention, the great revolution of finance in the 1980s is to have invented ways of transform debt into a profit-making asset. Asset, not an obligation, not a problem, an asset. And the bigger the pile of negative money, the bigger the debt, the better. The prime candidate at that point, the United States government debt, which under Reagan had become huge. It was a delight for finance to have this enormous pile of negative money. The fact that it was negative was neither here nor there. That took very creative work to transform debt into that kind of an asset with positive valence, with profit-making possibilities. Mind you, a lot of the debts that they tried to sell on the global market, I remember the Brazilian debt and a few other such debt, the Mexican debt, didn't work as well. They failed. But eventually they found the way. By the early 90s, they were selling the debt of Mexico, unguaranteed assets. They withdrew an instrumentality, the Brady bonds, that would have guaranteed the buyers of the debt. Finance took it to the next leg. It said, you know what, we're removing all guarantees from the United States government, and you're still going to want to buy the Mexican government debt. And they did. Investors flocked. Then that model was passed around to Argentina, to Morocco, to the world. It was a hit. Today, that possibility is still there, but the need to innovate continues to be part of global finance. What are they doing today? Again, I'm assuming that I'm not saying anything new to some of you in the room. Well, today it has become an enormously complex set of innovations that play on the interests, on debt, on derivatives that represent some real asset way, way at the end of a very long road. That is brilliant. That is truly innovative. And again, the complexity of these instruments is enormous. It can forget what it is that it is developing that instrument on. It operates inside a complicated intermediate sector that rarely loses. The ones who lose are the ones that are a bit outside. I could go on and on, but I don't want to do that, giving you examples of how, and this is the critical point, how finance has managed to invent instruments that make profitable investments that we thought could never work. When I then look at the question of low-income housing, and I bring into the picture of financing low-income housing the fact that some of these financial instruments work on a very particular intersection. It is the possibility, and this is critical for the most sophisticated instruments, it is the possibility of extracting a profit that is often a fraction of 1%. Little profit. The only thing that makes that work is an intersection with a second element, which is quantity. That is why originally in the simpler model, the bigger the debt, the better. You need large numbers. Well, where do you get large numbers? Low-income housing needs. Is there a possibility of inventing an instrument that would allow investors to make even a fraction of a profit, but playing off on huge numbers, and hence make it worthwhile? I was very impressed with the figures mentioned today in terms of private housing construction in Turkey. I don't mean private housing, I mean government sector for, however, private households who would then own it, have mortgages, but pay the equivalent of rent. That is a very impressive combination of elements, and I think that is an innovation. The country I grew up in, Argentina, at one point, long known for very, let's say, stormy finances. Argentina, you know, the first modern default in sovereign default in modern history. They invented an instrument that was a mortgage instrument in the early 90s when they were in a certain phase, coming out of prosperity, moving into a crisis, that actually was sold on the global markets. It was a brilliant instrument, and it captured particular conditions, possibilities, and constraints in the case of Argentina, and it was sold on the global markets. Morocco developed a financial instrument that also was sold on the global markets, that actually made it on the global markets. And I mention all of this because there is a quality when you really go digging into the financial sector. What you see is vast numbers of people trying to invent new instruments. When you look at it that way, when you take into account the work of making, the multi-sidedness of that world of making, mind you, it is totally controlled by London and New York and a few other major centers, no doubt. But I did mention Argentina and I did mention Morocco, and there are a variety of other such places. When you begin to look at global finance that way, then you begin to see possibilities of finance as a work of making. Finance today mostly is actually quite destructive, I would say. The image that you get from finance and that I have is a vast machinery with enormous capabilities in desperate search for good investments. When Russia didn't turn out to be what it was hoped it would be, that was a real disappointment for the global investment community, because suddenly there went a zone that was hoped would produce huge profits. And you can sort of tell the story one after the other that way. So one way of thinking about finance is this mix, an enormous capability roving around the world in search of good investment options. On the other hand, all these makers, all these inventors, all these enormously creative types. I always say that the international accountants today compete in creativity with the international financiers. These are two very creative sectors. And then you begin to look at the world of need. And low-income housing is one of the big ones. And one really does have a question as to why it is that an instrument cannot be developed. And as I speak, I am sure that there are all kinds of firms where you have young, brilliant software mathematical types who are trying to invent that instrument, not because they care about low-income housing, but because it is the ultimate irresistible temptation. The numbers are huge, and the instruments exist to make profitable that where you can get less than 1% if you can bundle it up. As I was hearing the wonderful presentations this morning, I was wondering, God, what is next here in Turkey? Again, the mortgage instrument that you have developed is very interesting. And I was imagining, what if, given sort of the collective will that I detect to address the question of housing, and to address it in a way that can enter through the capital markets, let's say, What if an instrument were invented here that would join those two? And you need more than 60,000 units here and the 5,000 units there. I heard one of the presenters say that the need is for over 2 million housing units. You are talking thresholds there. You're really talking about a significant quantity. Now, as an urbanist, as a political activist, as an urban activist, I like making this analysis about finance because I want to bring finance down. In some ways, we all need finance. Finance is a very bad name, but we all need finance. If we're a little shop owner and we can get a little loan, it will make a difference. If we're a little community housing group and we can get a reasonable loan, it can take us to the next step. So when I talk about finance the way I talk about finance, and I have been studying finance for 15 years, especially global finance, I see a possibility of at least bringing part of this enormously powerful sector engaged, bringing some of that into a place where it can get engaged with the question of low-income housing. When I say that the newest instruments, that the newest innovations are predicated on counting on less than 1% profit with the Phillips curve effect of large numbers, low-income housing is a perfect case because if you could really operate on a very, very low, just the objective cost of money as opposed to a big interest burden, it would actually mean that community housing entities, small community owners, potential owners, could be part of that effective demand. Because at the heart of my concern is this notion of an effective demand that we can build out of a real need. Because that real need is huge, there is a possibility there of, and given the new types of financial instruments, there is a possibility. When I heard this morning the Prime Minister say that, if I understood it right, that the 19.7 billion, I don't know if Turkish dollars or liras or US dollars, I don't know what the figure was, but it was big, in housing construction capital by Turkish companies operating in 64 countries. Again, I think I remember correctly. That's interesting. That creates a possibility of a specialized circuit in finance, multi-sited, global, inserting the newest innovations into that circuit. You're already operating in 64 countries. I'm sure that many of those countries have serious housing needs. I always like to say the United States is a very rich country with a lot of very poor people, 50 million poor people. Imagine 50 million poor people in Turkey. It's a lot. And many of them have serious housing problems, very, very bad housing problems. Maybe it's not the shanty phenomenon, but in relative terms, it's bad, causing allergies, lead poisoning from peeling paint. We're talking serious stuff. It made the visual is not the shanty, but the health conditions, the rats, the cockroaches, the allergies that small children, we have an enormous problem. The United States has not been able, and I think because of the lack of determination ultimately of the government, to insert some of these bad housing enclaves into financial circuits that would be viable. What I liked about hearing politicians speak this morning, when politicians speak, one sort of leans backward and says, all right, let me enjoy it, or let me not enjoy it. But I was really struck by the will that I detected to get on with the business building, with the business of building. But of course, the numbers are way below what you need. So The other point I should mention, because it's not necessarily sufficiently known, is that when we speak about global finance, we speak about hundreds of specialized financial circuits. I just did an analysis of commodity futures exchanges. There are 73 commodity futures, agriculture and minerals and in energy. Istanbul, by the way, is a very significant market for something. The level of specialization, when you really break it down, is significant. For instance, we all know that New York is big and London is big, etc. But sunflower seeds, the main market, 90% of the global market on commodity futures on sunflower seeds, is in Buenos Aires. Istanbul, and I'm sure that somebody in the room knows it, I don't recall, I don't want to make a mistake, but Istanbul has a very significant share of one commodity futures market. Again, I can't recall what it is. You go down the list, and there is quite a presence of all kinds of places when you begin to look at finance that way. When you look at the aggregate figures, all you see is London and New York. It's extraordinary how dominant they are. You break it down a bit, you bring in another 20 cities. When you look at gold, the good, or let's just do gold, the financial instrument, the futures on gold. London, Zurich dominate. When you bring in gold, the good, Johannesburg, Sydney, Sao Paulo move in. So when we think of finance as made up of multiple highly specialized circuits, and again, it's over 100 of these circuits if you look at all financial instruments being traded. Then coming back and concluding this notion of an existing capital operating in 64 countries already, a government interested in developing innovative instruments to help people own their homes, to help low-income people own their homes, I say, why not take it to the next leg and invent an instrument that can precisely function on this notion of large numbers and very small fractions on the individual units of profit, and transform that enormous need for housing into an effective demand. The US has been unable to do this because the government has not been willing to be an actor in this kind of market, because the capital is there, and we have a huge need for housing. I see in this government a willingness to work on that front. What I have not talked about, but I think the panel that follows me, is something that I care enormously about, which is the perspective from the communities, because it can't all be top-down. In the thesis, the experiment that I put out here, lies the possibility on that same model, and thinking in terms of this very specialized financial circuit, lies the possibility for community organizations to also be players, because they have to think themselves as part of the numbers question that makes that financial instrument predicated on a less than 1% profit on the unit possible. So they are part of the story. Every single low-income potential housing owner, every small cooperative is part of transforming a need into an effective demand under this kind of model. I thank you very much for your attention.